And we're live. Welcome to Music Matters 2020. I'm your host, Jason Tramm, and thank you for joining our new and unique podcast community where we explore the issues in the arts and music today in this unique period in 2020 in the era of COVID and many changes in the artistic world. And we're so glad that you've joined us. In this unique podcast, we explore these issues as seen through the eyes of distinguished colleagues from the performing arts. We have a wonderful show for you today with a distinguished conductor, Maestro Gursky, who will be joining us today, and we're delighted to have him with us. But first, remember to subscribe, hit the bell for the most up-to-date information on upcoming guests and topics, and join us on our website at jasontram.net. And like us on YouTube as well. So thank you so much for being a part of our new podcast community, and we welcome Maestro Gursky. A little bit about Maestro Gursky before we begin. I'm a very renowned opera conductor. He was born in Tel Aviv, Israel, and trained in New York. Made his professional conducting debut in 2007, leading a critically acclaimed performance of Don Giovanni with the Washington National Opera. Since that, he's guest conducted some of the most prestigious opera companies in the world: Los Angeles Opera, Opera de Bellas Artes in Mexico, Wolf Trap Opera, Opera Maine, Opera Birmingham, the Manhattan School of Music, the University of Michigan, Yale School of Music, and he's returned multiple times to the Washington National Opera. Between 2014 and 17, he was Kapellmeister for Theater Regensburg in Germany, conducting over 120 performances. From the 2017-18 season, he was Kapellmeister of Theater Bremen, and he had a very busy schedule there. He's also had a very strong artistic collaboration with Maestro Placido Domingo, and has conducted many concerts with the great tenor, and was very much involved with the Operalia competition, launching the careers of many of the biggest stars in opera. And since 2012, Maestro Gursky has been the principal conductor of Teatro Graticello in Manhattan, conducting really interesting performances of rare Verismo gems. So welcome, Israel Gursky, and thank you so much for joining Music Matters 2020.
Thank you for having me, Jason. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So tell me about your journey as a conductor. Did you always know you wanted to be a conductor?
That was really not the case with me. I am very much a late bloomer in all aspects of my career. I trained from a young age as a pianist, and till I was about 25 or so, I really just thought I was going to be a solo pianist. And then I found that throughout my career, a lot of stuff happened almost by coincidence, not by design, not by my own planning, but because circumstances kind of led me in a certain direction. So after studying in Israel, I went to do a doctorate in piano performance in New York at Stony Brook, where I studied with a wonderful teacher, Gilbert Kalish. And during my years at Stony Brook, I had a scholarship that, of course, covered my tuition and also my living expense. It was a very generous scholarship, and as part of it, to do some work. And part of the work was accompanying studios and the opera productions of the school. And I started getting into it, not by design, simply because this was how my scholarship operated. But I found that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the work with singers, I enjoyed the repertoire, I had an affinity to it. And there was a faculty member at Stony Brook, Thomas Morocco, who was also teaching accompanying at Manhattan School of Music. And he told me in no uncertain terms, you have got to come and study with you at the Manhattan School of Music, which I did. So I continued my studies there, and I specialized in accompanying, in opera coaching, in art song repertoire, the languages, learned how to coach, learned the diction. And that led me, I think very fortunately, to the career of a vocal coach. And upon graduating, I participated in San Francisco Opera's Merila program, which is, of course, a wonderful young artist summer program, and received some wonderful training there. Then I continued working at Wolf Trap Opera. And through Wolf Trap, which is in suburban Washington, D.C., I got connected to the Washington National Opera. And I think within 1 year of graduating at the Manhattan School of Music, I started at the Washington. Then it was just the Washington Opera. It became national, I believe, in 2003, simply as a repetiteur. I'm using the European term. At the time, I was just very happy. And of course, the Washington Opera at the time was a very full opera company led already by Placido Domingo as general director, artistic in general, I believe. And we had a lot of wonderful productions and a lot of very well-known international singers, and I really enjoyed that. And after doing that work, I also guest appeared as a coach in other opera companies throughout the United States. I started getting the itch to conduct myself. And even though I was in my early 30s by then, I got a late start as a conductor and really didn't want to enroll in a school anymore. I kind of had enough of that after many years of formal study. So I just took on a path of studying privately with several wonderful conducting teachers. And for a period of several years, I did really very, very many conducting workshops. And I was very fortunate that the Washington Opera kind of allowed me, even though I was just starting, to start assisting other conductors, and eventually allowed me to make my debut there in 2007.
So you took that European route, but in America. That's very interesting.
Right. It's interesting because the European route is, of course, very important. And if we look at the history of so many great conductors of the past, from Gustav Mahler through his disciples like Bruno Walter, Klemperer, Mengelberg, Karl Böhm, so many people who took a very defined path of starting in a company as a repetiteur, playing for the rehearsals, working with the singers, playing under the conductors, and slowly building their way up, getting some experience conducting, then moving to another company. So it has been a very distinct path for many conductors to build up their career. And nowadays, when we look at the conducting world, there are fewer people who take this path. Now, there is, of course, much more formal study. There are conducting programs in graduate schools which did not exist 30 or 50 years ago. And we have the conducting competitions and assistantship for orchestral conducting, doing it in symphony orchestras. But you could absolutely say that I took a rather old-fashioned path in the way of becoming a conductor.
Well, it certainly paid you off well, and you've risen to a wonderful level, and you're out there working so busy. Describe to us what a typical week was like before the COVID-19 virus hit. What was a normal, I say normal, but what was a typical week of your work schedule back before all this happened?
I should frame it that while I stayed at the Washington Opera for quite a long time, I was there in some capacity for 14 years, and I think 7 or 8 of them I was there full-time. I did make a big move to Germany in 2014, and perhaps I should talk about the typical life of a conductor in the German system. And you were asking, what is a typical week like? Well, it is extraordinarily busy. The thing is, the German theater system, the opera houses in Germany, operate in a very different way, which is unfamiliar to those of us working and experiencing opera in the United States. And the big difference is, well, there are several big differences, is that at the core of the theater is an ensemble, a permanent ensemble of singers, conductors, and coaches that form the backbone to the entire operations of the theater. And I was, of course, part of that core group in the 2 theaters where I worked, in Regensburg and in Bremen. Regensburg, in particular, is a mid-size city in the south of Germany, in the state of Bavaria, where the theater physically is not extremely big. It's a beautiful 19th century theater, beautiful outside and inside, and it sits about 500 people. That's what we refer to as a European-sized theater. And it had a very, very enthusiastic, loyal, and large audience, which meant that the theater performed roughly 190 performances of opera per season. You also have to remember that in Regensburg, like in many other smaller and mid-sized European cities, German cities, the theater does everything. It does opera, it does concerts, symphony concerts, chamber concerts. It also puts on theater performances, musicals, operetta, dance performances, children performances in various areas. So overall, the theater in Regensburg was putting roughly 600 different performances per season, of course, using, I believe, 4 different venues.
Wow.
So what you read from my resume earlier, which is correct, that during 3 seasons in Regensburg I conducted roughly 120 performances, is absolutely correct. The theater, and that is very typical of many theaters in Germany, they have about 7 or 8 new productions each season, and they revive, depending on the size of the theater, another 5 or 6. And they run those productions throughout the entire season. So on a typical week, there were many weeks, I remember them very vividly, where I conducted, say, 4 performances in 1 week of 4 different operas, while rehearsing another and coaching 2 or 3 others.
Wow.
So I definitely had to keep a lot of information.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I can only imagine how your technical skill and your facility, you were forced to do such high level work so fast. That must be great for your for everything musical and artistic to gel.
Definitely, you build a lot of muscle. And one thing that I remarked to myself after being in Germany for a year or 2 is how, in a good way, routine a performance seemed. When I was still in the US, you just don't get the opportunity to conduct as frequently. So each time you have a performance, it's a big event. You're like, you get up in the morning, oh my God, I have a performance tonight. What should I eat? What should I drink? Should I exercise? Should I study the score? In Germany, it's pretty routine that you would have on the day of a performance a rehearsal in the morning for something else. And you're like, oh, I guess I have a performance tonight. What is it? Magic flute. I'd better open the score and look at it again.
Those recits, those accompagnato recits are always a fun part of that score.
They always are. And, you know, I mentioned magic flute, Salzburg flute, for a reason, because as opposed to the US, in Germany, it is the #1 most performed opera.
Is it really? I did not know that.
Well, I think the German audiences do care very much about pieces that are in their native language. Salzburg flute, the magic flute, it has dialogue which is extremely engaging. It is family friendly. Everyone loves Papageno. Everyone hates the Queen of the Night. It's not easy to cast, as you know, because it's a large cast and some of the parts are really difficult, especially Queen of the Night or Sarastro, the low bass. But also in my experience, I think by now Salzburg flute is the opera I've conducted the most, both in the US and in Germany. And I think it always sells extremely well.
Yeah, everyone loves the melodies are infectious. There's not a moment of just sparkling Mozart.
Right.
Is it what it does? Isn't that one of the first Singspiels? That's an early Singspiel, right? That sits right in the early part of that repertoire.
Yes, very much so. I believe Mozart wrote Zaide, which is an uncompleted Singspiel, much earlier in his life. And then really Magic Flute is his second important opera written in his native tongue, German. He wrote the Abduction from the Seraglio about 10 years prior. And that I think is an opera that very much marks his maturing as a composer of opera. And of course, Abduction also has dialogue, but I don't think it's quite what you would define as Singspiel.
Have you done a lot of German operetta in your work at the opera houses there?
Yes, I've done quite a few, especially in Regensburg, and I got to love this repertoire. In addition to complete operettas, and I remember very fondly Im Weißen Rössel, which is a piece that is, I think, virtually unknown here in America, but I think in Germany and in Austria, everyone just knows every tune. We have done in both houses quite a lot of operetta concerts, and that music is so wonderful. Of course, it's music written by Germans, well, a lot of time by Hungarians, if you think of Kallmann or Lehár, but there were Hungarians who took that art form and brought the German or the Austrian flavor into it. But here is music that speaks so much to the German audiences.
Was there an adjustment period being a Israeli person trained in America, then moving to Germany? Was there an adjustment period getting yourself into society in Germany, into the theater world out there?
Definitely, I think that's a great question. As a Jew and as an Israeli, and I should add to that my father lost his entire family in the Holocaust. It wasn't so easy mentally to adjust to the idea of going to Germany and working there and becoming a resident. But I should mention that this was an adjustment or a thought process that came before going over there. Because quite honestly, once I arrived, I just had to work all the time. There isn't much time to ponder who am I and how is it living here and working here. You just do the work. And of course, as a musician, your interaction is primarily with other artists. And our art form, regardless of where you are, tends to be very international. So both theaters had a very international profile of the ensemble and of the guest artists. And there wasn't so much a sharp contrast of moving from the United States to Germany in terms of the profile of the people I was working with on a daily basis. Of course, I had to force myself to study German very, very quickly. I received the offer from Regensburg back in May of 2014, and I had to start working there in September. So I got very busy and studied as hard as I could in the 3 months I had. And that is very important. You have to speak the language.
And it must be a very fast transition, and then to jump into the rehearsal process and to constantly be studying and as an artist. And how exciting.
It is exciting. I should also mention that I grew up in Israel, which is of course a fascinating place to be brought up in. You don't realize that as you grow up there because, well, this is your immediate environment and you don't really compare it to anything else. But it's a country that was founded mostly within the last 100 years, and achieved statehood in 1948, just over 70 years ago, and is a country that is very, very much based on immigration, and very much based on immigration from Europe. My piano teacher for most of my childhood and growing up years came from Germany. He was born in Nuremberg and studied in Germany and went to Palestine, as it was then called, during, I believe, the 1930s, as the Nazis rose to power in Germany. So in a way, growing up in Israel, one is immersed in a culture that is really a multiculture, because you get some of everyone's background, whether it's the Jews who came from Russia or Poland or Ukraine, or from Germany and Austria, or from Northern Africa, or from the Middle East countries. And everyone is bringing to the table something that they had at home in their origin countries. And even when we have in Israel now so many people who are a second and a third and a fourth generation Israelis, some of those traditions simply remained there. And I think as I was making the move from the United States to Germany, I realized that Germany had some things that were familiar for me from my childhood. Also in the way that people shop, people eat, people interact with each other, people respond to culture. And while, of course, any adjustment is difficult, there were things in my adjusting to life in Germany that were quite heartwarming and brought fond memories from my earlier years.
I'm glad to hear that. That's wonderful. We had a Holocaust survivor on the show. She was 90, a really close friend of mine who was 93 years old, who was a survivor from the concentration camps, and she from Poland, and then she settled in Israel. And she would tell the story of a conductor friend of hers who put together a choir, but everyone spoke a different language, so they had to be able to sing in different languages, and how that was really the mosaic that made Israel interesting for her when she was moved there before she came to the United States.
Right.
And
I think in that sense, growing up in Israel, which is a culture of so many different cultures, and being a musician, has some similarities. That story you just told reminds me of a story told by Heinz Fricke. Heinz Fricke, who passed away age 88 a few years ago, was for many years the music director of the Washington Opera. And prior to that, he passed through Oslo, but his main job for many decades was as music director of the Staatsoper Berlin, which was then part of East Germany. And he had many fascinating stories. He was a wonderful and fascinating man in many, many ways, being really from the old generation. But he told about the performance of Don Carlo he had to conduct one day, and as often happens in opera, there are cancellations. People get sick, and you have to, in the last moment, find someone who can sing the role. And remember, this is also the era where many countries performed operas in their native language. So Germans performed in Germany.
Wow.
And so on. Germans performed in German, not in Germany. Well, that is obvious. But I think he told that there was a Romanian who sang in Romanian, a Russian who sang in Russian, a Bulgarian who sang in Bulgarian, and the rest sang, of course, in German. I don't think a single person sang it in Italian.
In the same cast, in the same show.
Not in the same cast. But can you imagine?
Wow. That's similar to was it Jussi
sort
Björling's
of reminds me. Right. There is a wonderful recording from the Bolshoi, I believe in the 50s, of the final duet of Carmen with Irina Arkhipova and Mario del Monaco. And she's singing in Russian, he's singing in Italian. Nobody's singing in the original French, and it's still wonderful and extremely convincing and touching.
Isn't that what makes opera so special? Is that so some people say it's not an Italianate sound, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's the what each artist bring individually makes it so much more special. I'm always amazed by that,
Indeed.
what the artists bring.
Right.
And
And now we are in the era of COVID-19, which of course changes everything. And I believe this was also a topic you were going to get into.
it's a great time to get there because we're all in it and we're swimming around in this boat on this turbulent ocean. So tell us what that's done to your career right now. What does it look like from going from international, you're crossing the Atlantic to conduct opera frequently in both places, to what does it look like now?
Well, Jason and I chatted very briefly during the sound check before this started, and I mentioned, well, this season was going to be a really great season, and here we are. And of course, it's very disappointing, and this is pretty much happening to everyone worldwide. I was going to be right now in Portland, Maine, conducting a production of Flying Dutchman, going from there to the Salzburg Festival, having a lot of next season working at the Met in New York, which is now seeing its season, at least for now, reduced. It will only begin at the end of December instead of at the end of September. And I'm, of course, like everyone else, hoping that this crisis will end sooner rather than later. But it's a difficult situation. So I was going to be on the road very much the entire season, and now I'm home in New York. And what do they say? Make lemonade out of lemons. So I'm looking at the positive things, because I do have a partner and he lives in New York, and we've been together for 23 years now.
Wow, that's a
which is a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
It is a blessing, but as you can imagine, especially since I moved to Germany, we have not been able to see each other as often, and we've had now over 3 months of living in the same apartment, in our apartment in New York City. And that has been, without question, a real blessing. It's just so wonderful to experience that as a musician. How often can we have that luxury? So that has been good. I still do some work online. I obviously cannot work in person, but I'm grateful that here and there I get to work with singers, or I get to teach, or I get to give a master class, and I'm quite grateful to be able to do that.
I know you're quite in demand as a vocal coach among the professional opera singers in New York City. Have you been coaching quite a lot these days via Zoom or Skype or?
I've been reduced to coaching exclusively on. To be specific, I prefer, as a technical medium, FaceTime audio. I'm not as big a fan, technically speaking, of Zoom or Skype, but the idea is the same, and we all refer to it, let's have a Skype lesson, or let's have a Skype coaching. So I've been doing it some, but the thing that makes it difficult for everyone is that the whole classical music, the whole performing art profession is in an induced coma right now. Basically, there are, of course,
great
some signs
description.
of life.
Great description.
There are. I don't think I originated that. I probably read it.
I appreciate it very much.
Well, of course, we all try to make something still happen. The bulk of what we do is not there anymore, and as a coach, someone who works with singers, there are 2 things. One is that the singers who come work with me would be preparing for something, would be preparing for the next job, for the next audition. At the moment, all of those are canceled. And that, of course, leads us to the second thing, which is most performing artists have very little income right now. And it's unfortunate, but you need a certain income in order to afford to go to coachings and to lessons. I tell the singers that work with me that they have to look at this time as an opportunity because eventually this will be over. We don't know when. It's obviously already taking longer than we were hoping for, and we don't quite see the end, but it will end one way or another. And I think those of us who survive this crisis, and I think that's a point we're going to have to touch on a little bit later, but for those of us who will survive and be able to swim to the other shore, so to speak, if we use the free time that we have to grow and to develop, that could be, again, a wonderful thing. You asked me what I do during the time, and obviously I have a wonderful Steinway piano at home, and I've been playing a lot, and I find myself having not really seen myself as a solo pianist for several decades now, that this is something that I enjoy and something that I can keep growing. And maybe we can touch just a little bit later, but I've actually engaged myself and sort of forwarded myself. Well, that's a German word. I've made myself responsible to grow. This is the German thing again. By forcing myself to learn the live pieces and recording them and posting them, either on social media or on YouTube.
I've really enjoyed those too. It's really wonderful to hear you play, and it's been to see our colleagues out there doing good work is such a blessing in this time for people who are sitting home, and I think we're all hurting in our own way. And to see my colleagues out there making beautiful music is really it's very uplifting.
Right. And I think that as a conductor, conducting is an area that encompasses so many other areas. And I see myself just continuing my development and my study and my learning and my growing just by playing piano a lot. Because I don't think that the two areas are separate from each other. One infuses the other. Everything infuses everything else in life and in music.
There's infinite growth in the musical field. You can always dig deeper into these great scores. Like a great Renaissance painting. If you look a slightly different angle, the painting changes and your perspective changes. And that's great advice to younger musicians too, that I tell my students, you have to be growing. You're never, the day you stop growing is the day you start dying.
Right. But the other point that I want to touch on is that I think this is really a very, very significant crisis for everyone in the world, but even more so for the performing arts. And I think you'd agree, probably, won't you?
It's about as serious as it can possibly get.
And for those listeners who are not quite aware, there are those charts right now that are going on in media outlets and in social media that sort of rate between, on a scale from 1 to 9, the level of danger, the level of exposure to COVID-19 that are associated with different activities. And it starts by, I think, number 1, which is playing tennis or taking a walk outside alone. And you would see that at the very top of the list is attending a music performance or going to a nightclub. And everyone remarked, and that's unfortunately true, that music and performing art performances are going to be the very last thing that will come back. And look at how difficult it is now with the discussion of what do we do with the schools? How do we open the schools? Will they open? Is it safe? How can we make it safer? And it is obvious that schools are going to open way before performing arts centers and concert halls are going to open.
What do you think is going to be the next chapter for the music industry when things do open? How do we? I would imagine, just because that Germany is government funded, that they're probably going to open before the American theaters. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a very big difference already between what's going on in Germany, Austria, and what's going on in the United States. And the issue of government support plays an enormous role in this. And I have to tell you, about 2 months ago or so, we had a Zoom meeting of the Met Music staff with Peter Gelb, with the general director. And that was exactly one of the issues that he touched on. He said that my colleagues in Europe have two big differences. One is that they get government support, which in the United States is almost not existent, and for many organizations simply not existent at all. And because they have the government support, and the government is paying for those organizations to operate and to perform, in many cases, the governments, whether it's the central or the local governments, mandate the theaters to start performing on a certain capacity, on a certain level. And that is very much what we see right now in Germany and in Austria. For example, the Salzburg Festival, where I was going to go this summer, has cancelled most of its performances, but is still going to put on a reduced schedule, starting I think in late July or at the beginning of August. And they still have 2 opera productions going on, and certain orchestral concerts and piano recitals and so on. But a big part of it is because the local government really wanted the festival to perform in a reduced capacity, to simply have something. This is also the 100th anniversary of the festival. The festival plays a very important role in the psyche also of people in Austria. It's probably, in Austria, the most important, but also internationally, one of the most important performing art festivals. It was very important for the society there to have something going on. And it really heads off to the festival that they are, despite the limitations of the coronavirus, are able to plan and execute something like that.
Yeah, it's amazing that there's a Traviata performance in Madrid that we see Michael Fabiano singing, and that I've seen posted on Facebook. And there is music happening, and people are finding ways, creative ways to do this and maintain social distancing.
Exactly. You realize that most theaters in Germany by now are rehearsing for the next season, which will open late August or early September, and almost all of them are putting some sort of performances, whether outdoor performances that people don't have to be as careful when they're outdoors, or indoor performances for much reduced audiences.
Interesting.
But in the US, one of the things mentioned by Peter Gelb, which holds true for most North American theaters, is if they perform indoors with social distancing, the cost will remain more or less the same, but they would just lose so much money that it's not economically feasible for them. So unfortunately, we have to wait until there is a medical solution, until there is a vaccine and or a combination of drugs that make COVID-19 much less of an issue. And until that is a reality, by and large, things are going to be what they are right now.
So I had a couple singer colleagues who I've been talking to. So the singers on fest contracts, are the government covering their salaries during this time when their performance schedules are limited or ground to a halt? What happens to the singers who are associated with the theater, the ensemble singers, the fest singers, the guest singers?
Right, the fest singers, and as you can imagine, I have still many friends who have exactly the type of contract, are for the moment probably among the very luckiest in this business. Because whatever conditions are changing in performing arts, they still get their monthly salary, and that is such a blessing for so many people. Many of them are beginning to work, as I mentioned, on the smaller, reduced capacity. There is, of course, the other thing, Jason, is the question, what is going to happen on the other end of COVID-19? We don't know. And the million-dollar question is, how long is this actually going to last? Right now, so many organizations in North America are planning on the premise that at the beginning of the year 2021, we will go back to performing. You have to plan. There is no way to do anything in this business unless you plan far in advance and in great detail. So they are simply making right now detailed plans that are based on this assumption. This assumption depends on what the virus does and what the medical solution will be and when it will come. We are all crossing our fingers that those plans will come to reality at the beginning of 2021, but there is, of course, no guarantee. So if we're not lucky and we have to keep postponing and canceling and reducing, it's a big economical question for every single organization in the world.
As a conductor who does a lot of regional things in America, I was just asked to do my first Parks concert. In the summer, I attend to a lot of park concerts, pops music type of things. And this one's going to be, they're looking at doing it in like a drive-in movie theater style. I just got the call yesterday. They want to have all the audience in their cars and have the orchestra on the stage distanced with the strings with masks, brass in another place, winds in another place, and distance.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be the most interesting performance I've done in my entire life. Then they're going to take that, mix it, put it in through a radio, and then they can turn on the radio station in their cars.
Right. And I've actually seen quite a number of drive-in classical performances happening in Germany in the last few weeks.
It seems like a dystopian novel. If someone would have told us that this would be music this year, I wouldn't have believed you.
Right. Nobody would have believed it. And a few weeks ago, it's a strange story, and I won't go into details, but we put on a neighborhood concert in the neighborhood where I live, in the Upper West Side. And a colleague of mine who's a stage director organized on a staircase of a townhouse near where she lives, and we got a keyboard, and we got a couple singers whom I knew from Yale School of Music while I was conducting there. And until a couple of weeks ago, we had in Manhattan every night at 7 p.m. the clapping for healthcare workers. So we timed it that it went right after the clapping, and we had roughly 150 people listen in, and it was just so wonderful for everyone involved, because I think there's just so much thirst and hunger of everyone to hear live music again, rather than hear it on YouTube or Zoom or Skype or any of those, just to experience right in front of your eyes and ears that is so rare and that is so badly needed.
I saw that, and that was another thing, one of those things that just made my day, just to see colleagues doing great, beautiful things. There are so many great singers in Manhattan, so many colleagues who are hurting so much, that to see them out there performing, doing what they love, and making people happy, right. It's a very special magic.
Yes. There's no question that once this crisis is over, people are just going to be so happy to hear live performances again. The same way, or even more so, than people being just so happy to be able to go and sit in a restaurant again. Or
get a haircut.
Go get a haircut. Well, I think you can do that in Manhattan already, but of course you have to wear a mask and all that. But there were so many things before this crisis started that we now take for granted. And I think chief among them to experience live performances of any sort, whether it be music, opera, ballet, theater, all these things that are now completely or almost impossible to do in their old form. I know I'm so hungry for that. I can't wait to go and hear an opera at the Met, or hear a concert at the New York Phil, or at Carnegie Hall, or a chamber music concert.
Or
So I know
even a
for sure.
rehearsal. I would give my left arm for a rehearsal, just to be in a rehearsal
Yes,
with artists again, and to have those colleagues with
yes,
me, or my choruses I work with, and
right.
it's
So there's no question. There's no question that there is hunger and thirst for that, but I don't know what the financial reality is going to be. We're sort of, in a way, living in a cocoon right now because there is a lot of federal and local financial support that is allowing people to get through this crisis, but we don't quite know how it will influence organizations and small businesses once this is over. And so much, well, not so much, all of the performing art organizations, big and small in the United States, are dependent on private money, on corporate funding, on support from big donors and small donors. We don't know what's going to happen at the other side of it. It will come back, that is for sure. But how quickly and what might the casualties in the meantime be? I don't know. It's a very scary question and nobody really knows.
I had our first question from the audience. Jack from New Jersey asks, so working in a German opera house, what are some of the most interesting productions of traditional operas that you've been involved in?
Hi, Jack from New Jersey. Great question. And I suspect you know a little bit about Regie Theater and how Germans like to sometimes produce their operas. I've seen everything, good and bad, and I'm not going to say that modern productions are bad or traditional productions are good. Not at all. I'm not seeing things that way. I think both ways of doing opera can be good or bad. There are several examples that I can think of, but let me mention two. One that turned out to be an enormous success in Regensburg was an opera called Hans Heiling, a piece that I don't think anyone or almost anyone in the States know. It's by Marschner. It's an early romantic German opera, early 19th century, have to do with underground dwarfs, and it's a little bit reminiscent of the call, but not quite. And we had a very, very creative production that, for the first section of the opera, most of the audience, about 400 members of the audience, being on stage, mingling with the singers. And then, I think for the rest of the opera, they kept tables and benches like you would see in a beer garden for about 100 or 120 lucky members of the audience who got to remain on the stage being served beer and sausages and sauerkraut while the rest of the opera went on. The orchestra, luckily, was where they're supposed to be, in the pit. That's not always the case in Austria. I've seen and conducted in all sorts of other configurations. But certain musicians from the orchestra had to go to the balconies, had to go backstage. The chorus had a big scene when they were singing from the upper balconies of the theater, as well as several of the soloists. And that worked great because somehow it connected to the plot of the opera. The audience just loved being on stage, loved having, in certain cases, the singers sing 2 feet away from them, loved seeing the conductor right in front of their eyes, this way, loved experiencing what it is to be an opera singer and hear the orchestra coming from straight in front of you. And it was a fantastic success, and I think they just ended up adding more and more performances because you couldn't sell enough tickets.
What was the musical style like of that piece? I don't know the composer.
Um, it's a little bit like what you would hear in the music of Schumann and Mendelssohn and um, Weber. Um, at the moment, I'm not sitting with Wikipedia in front of my eyes, so I can't really tell you. I want to say it's an opera from the 1830s, so kind of contemporary with Weber.
Post Beethoven,
It has
early Romanticism starting.
definitely early Romanticism, and you have um, the German setting, and you have the supernatural setting, where you have the underworld and the queen of the underworld, and her son named Hans Heiling, who wants to fall in love with a real human person, and he makes his way up to the earth and meets a girl who has a boyfriend who's a hunter. If it sounds like a lot of other romantic operas, it's because it's very similar. And you have the scenes of the dwellers of the underground, and you really hear music that is reminiscent of the Nibelung from the Rheingold, especially the ram pa 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 pam. You have a musical motive that is so similar. It's actually really good opera. He wrote another opera that's even slightly better known, Der Vampire, the Vampire. And I want to say New Orleans revived it 2 or 3 years ago. And again, it's a German setting, and it has to do with the unnatural.
Oh, the German Romantics, the early German, had such great topics and themes and such exciting music. Their Freischütz, of course, is
Right,
the most famous example
right,
of that, but it's great
right.
repertoire.
But I want to give Jack from New Jersey the rest of the answer, which is it's not always great, because I've also experienced or sometimes been involved in productions that went in a very modern way, but didn't always succeed. And you almost get the cliches of you have to have a pantomime on stage before the overture starts. You need to have videos on stage. You need to have blood and rape. You need to have live videos on stage. Um, and look, I appreciate so much of what German theaters are doing, because they're committed to the idea of let's modernize things and not do opera the way it has always been done. And a lot of times it's successful, but sometimes it isn't.
I guess it's the same with traditional productions. There are great ones, and there are ones that
Absolutely.
fall flat. But
Right.
the fact that the Germans can take such risks artistically really is exciting, and it must be exciting. And when it does work, it can really be special and something new, as opposed.
Very much
So
so.
I envy that they do so many performances that they have that possibility of risk taking.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think the fact that in Europe there are so many organizations that get as much government support enables them to take artistic risks. And having been in the working for the Salzburg Festival for the last 4 years, some of the productions I've experienced there, I'm thinking of a Bassarides 2 years ago, that was done in the Felsenreitschule, where the staging enormously wide and was divided in 3 parts. Krzysztof Walikowski was the director. He's a wonderful Polish, one of the great European directors working right now. Obviously, it's a piece of enormous size. I remember the Vienna Philharmonic not being able to fit into that enormous pit, and I remember 8 percussion players having the balcony. It was so enormous, and the choir of the Vienna State Opera was at hand doing fantastic work. I can imagine just how expensive it must be to put on something like that with a big cast, with an oversized chorus, with an enormous orchestra, done for the highest standards, and I believe only 4 performances at the end.
Wow.
but I, even though everything in Salzburg is always sold out, I did everything I could to go see the dress rehearsal and 2 additional performances because it was just so wonderful.
Well, I hope you get there soon as things start to, come together for the seasons to come. We had a question
Yes.
from Irene from New Orleans. New Orleans. What do you do when you're not doing music?
Irene from New Orleans, thank you for the question. It's a good question. Okay, so here's the honest answer. I just like music. And I think that my life has always revolved around music ever since I can remember. It's what I do for a living. It's what I do as a hobby. It's what I do to keep myself entertained. It's what I do as therapy because I find for me music has healing qualities. So no matter how difficult life can be, I always go back to music, either as a listener or as a performer or as someone who trains other people. So my life really revolves around music. But obviously I can't do music on every single waking time. I also enjoy cooking. And now, of course, I have much more time to cook. I enjoy exercise, so I've rediscovered exercise, especially yoga and Pilates in the last few years, and also just, regular weight training as something that is enormously important for my own well-being as a musician, because what we do is extremely taxing on the body. I love taking long walks and going for runs. And I really do enjoy movies. That's another hobby. And especially in these last few months when we had a lot of time, I try to watch as many old movies as I can, especially from their really early years, like 1930s. That's really quite something, and you learn so much about history and about what the world used to be like.
I always think of cinema as the opera of today. That was the all-encompassing art form that came about. But and it makes us reevaluate what opera can do now that we've had cinema. How do we keep the art form relevant? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and especially when you listen to movies scored in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and you listen to music written by Korngold, who was an extremely important classical and opera composer in his own right, or Franz Waxman, or Bernard Herrmann, who wrote for so many of the Hitchcock movies, and it's brilliant music. There is also there is an operatic quality. If you think of the score to Vertigo by Bernard Herrmann, it's a great Hitchcock movie. And I think Hitchcock let him do it, but the music is telling just so much of the story in that movie. It really is an actor on its own right in how much music is meaningful in that. And that is not to say that even nowadays we have some really, really terrific movie scores, and there are so many people that we could mention, and I won't even get into it. But I think, especially when you look at the old movies, there is an operatic quality and there is a sentimental quality and an emotional quality that was just so out there that we don't always get nowadays, don't you think?
Well, I think it's. I think with the composers, just they, especially the composers back then, they were connected. A lot of them fled the Nazis and came here when things started to get rough in Europe, and they brought that culture, that culture, and they added that to Hollywood. It's amazing how the connections
Yes.
of like Schoenberg and some of the and Stravinsky who fled Europe, and they added so much to the academic circles in America, and then to the musical circles. So it's amazing
Very
how
much
that
so.
cross pollination happened.
Very much so.
Well, Israel, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you, how can people find out more about you?
Well, these are, of course, social media, Facebook, Instagram. I'm under my own name, Israel Gursky. I have a website, israelgursky.com. Please visit. Please send me messages. I do respond to messages all the time, and I hope to stay in touch with as many listeners. And I want to thank you, Jason, for coming up with this initiative. I think Music Matters 2020 is a super project, and I want to thank you for having me. And I hope more people tune in and that we can keep music alive. And of course, I hope very much that we can keep music alive in the real world once COVID-19 is, please, a thing of history. Can't wait.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and continued success as things begin to unravel and come back together.
And to you too, Jason. I always enjoy seeing your many projects, and I really appreciate how you keep performing during the era of COVID-19 and doing the virtual performances. And I hope that you keep doing as much of them as you can, and I wish you all the possible success.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Music Matters 2020. Thank you, and if you enjoyed it, please subscribe on YouTube. Check us out on our website at jasontram.net, and like us on Facebook. If you like what you've seen, you can consider becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/mm2020, and anyone who joins gets a mug, a new mug, and one of our t-shirts. So thank you so much for considering that. And remember, keep music alive. Good night.